Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel DePetris. I'm a fellow at Defense Priorities, a think tank in Washington, D.C., focusing on realism and restraint in U.S. foreign policy. It's my pleasure this morning to greet you all to this flash event, talking about Venezuela and the various U.S. military operations that are currently ongoing in the Southern Caribbean. As we all know, the Trump administration has devoted the last 2 months towards deploying additional U.S. military firepower in the Caribbean, ostensibly to take the fight to drug cartels. But there's some questions as to whether the Trump administration's goals go beyond counter narcotics. The administration insists that all of the military assets deployed currently are in place to deter drug trafficking cartels from sending drugs northward to the United States. But there's speculation that the secondary or even primary goal is to squeeze Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's regime even further, either by compelling the Venezuelan military's leadership to split with Maduro or to defect from the regime in total. So we'll be talking about all of this this morning with three very prominent guests that I've read for a very long time and have gotten to know well. First up, we have Chris McCallion, who is a fellow at Defense Priorities. He focuses on U.S. grand strategy and is very into tune with these issues in the Western Hemisphere. We have Alexander Downs, who is a professor of political science and international affairs at the George Washington University, and he's recently he became a non-resident fellow for us at Defense Priorities as well. And we have Lindsey O'Rourke, who is a professor of political science at Boston College and has written a very, very good book about the history of covert operations in U.S. foreign policy. So I want to thank all three of you for joining us this morning. I guess, to start out with, a simple but loaded question is, how did we get to where we are? I mean, it seems like only a couple months before that Trump was dispatching Rick Grenell to Caracas and speaking with Maduro about various issue sets, whether it's migration or energy. And now we have the United States essentially saber rattling against Maduro's regime. So I'm wondering, all three of you, how do we get to such a dramatic 180-degree shift in a matter of months? Alexander, do you want to start us off, and then we could go around the table?
Sure, I can say a bit about that. And first of all, thanks very much for having me. You're right. Diplomacy seemed to be working in this case. Maduro was making concessions and offering the U.S. stakes in oil production and so forth in Venezuela, and then Trump abruptly a few weeks ago shut it off and said we're not negotiating anymore. That, I think, in part reflects the rise in prominence of Marco Rubio, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, who reportedly is really driving the train on this. He's before he joined the Trump administration, a well-known hawk, and favor of regime change in various places. And Stephen Miller is gotten on board, and the way this happened is Rubio was able to frame it as part of the war on drugs and part of the anti-immigration policy.
Lindsey, do you have anything to add on that? I mean, it does seem that there's a sort of an alliance or a tacit alliance between, Rubio on the one hand and Steve Miller on the others. Is there anything else that we should be looking at, either internally or externally?
No, I agree with Alex's assessment. I think if you look at the history of Venezuela, you'll see that, for dating back to the Obama administration, we have been putting a lot of economic pressure and sanctions on Venezuela with the hope of engendering regime change indirectly. During Trump's first term, he recognized the opposition leader as the interim government of Venezuela. And I think Alex is right that since in his second term, there was a split within the administration between the people who wanted to pursue negotiations, which actually had been working very well, and Rubio, who is now using, drug trafficking as a new rationale. But it feeds into this longer trajectory of seeking regime change.
Chris, I don't know about you, but for me, I'm not necessarily surprised that the U.S. military is sort of operating the Southern Caribbean, only because Trump seemed to be very adamant about the counter drug platform during his campaign, and of course during the first several weeks of his administration, he designated a long list of drug trafficking organizations as FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations. I am surprised about the speed with which we're sort of, bombing boats that are allegedly carrying drugs through the Caribbean to the United States. How quickly that has come about. I mean, it's only been since September through this month. I think there's been about 10 boats that have been destroyed. I was wondering if are you surprised at the extent to which the administration has sort of used military force, or are you kind of did you kind of like predict this all along?
No, I did not predict this all along, and I am, despite the fact that, as Lindsey and Alex were saying, there is a fair amount of continuity here with longstanding U.S. policy. That being said, Trump made a point of trying to mark himself as being a break with a lot of that U.S. policy. And so to some extent, we're all kind of engaging in a little bit of speculation and Kremlinology about what's even happening within the White House itself, who's driving what and why. It's even more confusing given the fact that Maduro basically made a whole series of offers to the Trump administration, including stepping down or having some kind of transitional government. So the asks here from the Trump administration basically seem unconditional, and it seems like they want to have some kind of conflict. They want to have some kind of little war, and it's kind of hard to avoid the conclusion that, to some extent, Dan, you and I wrote this paper on no GWAT narco in Mexico, and we were worried about there being some kind of strikes in Mexico. It seems as though Trump himself was kind of intent on turning the drug war into some kind of a real war, and somebody probably told him that that wasn't going to be feasible in Mexico. And so, as the meme goes, Trump can have a little war in Latin America as a treat, and it's just that will be in Venezuela. So I am surprised, and I think that it's very hard to see what the upshot of all this could be. It's very hard to think about a good conclusion coming from this, and there are just so many risks involved, and it seems so arbitrary and so capricious that even though we could maybe expect that there would be some kind of a hard line taken on Venezuela under a second Trump administration, I do think that it's the degree of militarization and the amount of pressure that they're putting on them is unusual. In my own view, I think maybe the only conclusion to come away with is that they intend to make some kind of an example out of Venezuela, and particularly that this plays into a broader strategy in the hemisphere, where their conception of hemispheric defense is about pushing back on left-wing governments, on pink-tide governments. Maybe Maduro is the lowest hanging fruit or the easiest target, but that they also want to set an example for even kind of softer left-wing governments, whether it's Lula or Petro, who's also now been designated an enemy of the U.S. And the point that we should be making all the time is that this is contrary to a whole set of other goals that the administration has laid out, whether that's trying to stem the flow of immigration, and indeed whether it's to stop the drug flow. I think it's obvious that the drug rationale for these strikes is just a pretext. They know that Venezuela is not the main source of drugs into the U.S. or even a major source of drugs in the U.S. Right? I think that, and so it's very odd because it's contrary to a whole bunch of domestic goals that the administration's laid out, and that are much more important to the American people. Right? Americans do care about the drug problem. Many Americans care about what they see as an immigration problem, but I don't think anybody in the U.S. really, except for potentially the emigre community of Cubans, like Marco Rubio. I don't think there are that many people that actually care about who's in power in Caracas.
Yeah, I mean, I sense that for Rubio, at least. I mean, this is just supposition on my part, but for Rubio, it's not necessarily the drugs. It's using the drug issue as a way station to uh, topple Maduro, which in turn would increase pressure on the Cubans, right? Because the Venezuelans have been sending Cuba heavily subsidized oil for over 2 decades. So I think for Rubio, it's more of a holistic strategy that he's had all along. For Trump, I don't think personally he really cares about Maduro one way or the other. I do honestly think it's about counter narcotics in Trump's mind. And I say that with the preface that it's very difficult to predict on the outside what Trump is thinking every 5 seconds. So keep that in mind. Alexander, did you want to jump in? I think you had something you wanted to
Sure.
say.
I just add a couple of points to what Chris said. The first is to agree on the drug thing as a pretext. This is, if anything, we should be bombing Mexico. Of course, Mexico's our ally, so that's not really feasible. But everybody knows, including from U.S. government reports, that the vast majority of fentanyl, the vast majority of cocaine is coming through the Mexico Central American route. There's essentially no fentanyl coming from Venezuela. There's a minor amount of cocaine that's sent out of Venezuela. So this is clearly a useful cover for Rubio to advance other objectives. And I think the Cuba thing, his ultimate goal as a descendant of Cuban emigres would be to go after Cuba. Second point I would make is it's very interesting says something about intra-Trump administration dynamics, that the president is essentially allowing Rubio and Miller to sort of go off and dictate, to a certain extent, U.S. policy in this matter. Let's not forget, right? America first. We're not going to run around the world doing stupid regime change wars. He's very clear about this in the campaign. Those crazy neocons, went off and tried to spread democracy all over the place, and it blew up in their faces. And we're not going to do this anymore. Except now we are going to do it. And the idea is somehow this time it'll be different, which we've heard many times before. So it's kind of a strange thing to see this policy seemingly bubbling up from below, and the president seeming to not be that involved, or certainly not directing it.
Lindsey, if we take as, and of course this is an assumption, we don't know if the administration has decided to overthrow Maduro as a matter of policy, although it certainly looks like that's going to happen. It wouldn't be the first, of course, it wouldn't be the first regime change operation in Latin America. We can go through a long list of things that occurred in the Cold War, even prior to the Cold War. I'm sort of wondering, historically, how successful has the campaign of regime change in Latin America been to the United States? Has it had any benefits to us in terms of our security and prosperity, or is it sort of short-term benefits and the costs are sort of swept under the rug or ignored?
The history of covert regime change in Latin America is almost uniformly negative. There's very, very little to point to say that this would be a good idea. In my book, I looked up all the times that we tried to overthrow a Latin American government during the Cold War. I came up with 18 separate campaigns against countries. Not all of them succeeded, but even the ones that did succeed, some famous ones that people know, Guatemala in 1954, the Bay of Pigs, the assassination attempts against Castro, Dominican Republic in 1961, when we inadvertently had the leader assassinated during a US-backed coup, Bolivia, British Guiana in the 60s, Brazilian coup in 1964, supporting the Contras in Nicaragua in 1980s. Not one of these led to a stable pro-U.S. outcome. Instead, what they tended to fuel was civil wars, authoritarianism. It harmed democracy. We overthrew democracy on a number of occasions. Refugee flows. There's just really no successful example to point to of a covert regime change working out in America's interest. So the idea that we could do this in Venezuela, I think is, there's no historical precedent to say that it would work.
I sort of get a kick out of the Panama analogy, right? I mean, we hear like, well, we did send 20,000, 25,000 troops to Panama to arrest Manuel Noriega, and we eventually sent him to a U.S. courtroom and tried him and convicted him and prosecuted him. So why can't we do it in Venezuela? Chris, I'm sure you've kind of read that argument on countless occasions over the last week. I think it would be good maybe if you could tell us that or explain to us why the Panama case is not necessarily the most appropriate case to be using in terms of Venezuela, just considering the size of the country and the demographics and the terrain. Why are we still using the Panama analogy if there's so many differences between Panama and Venezuela in terms of just very basic metrics?
Well, I think people are using the Panama analogy because it's there and it was seen as a success. I would defer to Alex and Lindsey actually to give us all the reasons why regime change of this kind won't work, because they're experts on that. I mean, so far, right, it seems clear that or I should say, the administration hasn't said anything about sending large numbers of troops to Venezuela to occupy it. And I think even though, I mean, the fact of the matter is the whole change in U.S. foreign policy that we would expect from the Make America Great Again slogan has always been shaky. Trump, in his first term, and indeed in this term, has been quite militaristic. It's just that I think they always want war on the cheap. Right, and that itself is a bad inheritance of the prior decades of U.S. foreign policy. The kind of idea that we can have these wars that are low casualty, low in cost, that nonetheless are able to remake entire societies and trade out one government for another. The question is there actually any kind of viable opposition? And I should say even before that the question of the chances of success or the actual mechanics of regime change in Venezuela are already conceding too much. It almost implies that would be desirable and would advance U.S. foreign policy interests were it to happen. And I don't think that that's a concession we should make. I think it's a bad idea to do this and try to engineer other societies. But if the administration is intent on doing this, the question is whether there's any kind of stable opposition capable of governing inside Venezuela. And there have been a number of coup attempts already over the past few years, past few decades in Venezuela. Some, more half-hearted than others. But each time, right, it's more or less been stymied by the fact that the military has ended up backing Maduro or Chavez in previous years. And, it's become a meme that Juan Guaido, who we announced as the legitimate president of Venezuela, is actually this, entirely kind of, leader of nothing, basically, or, certainly not leader of a new governing coalition, right, with real power behind them. So I think that, there's a whole question of whether or not, if we do go down the route of covert regime change without some kind of a major troop deployment, and I want to be clear that I'm not advocating for any kind of major troop deployment, much to the contrary. But if we do go down that route, do we then just turn a state within our own hemisphere on the Caribbean into a kind of smoldering, chaotic, ungoverned zone where different, groups of armed men are contending with one another, and turn it into a kind of Libya-like situation, in which case we should expect, millions of people fleeing the country, spilling over into other countries in the region, almost certainly trying to come to the United States, and creating all kinds of unintended consequences. Given the impact that had in the Middle East and indeed on Europe after our misadventures in the Middle East over the past few decades. I think that's something that we want to avoid at all costs happening within our own hemisphere.
Well, what about that, Alex? I mean, do you think sort of a Libya-style scenario post-Maduro in Venezuela is more likely than a transition to democracy that, so many people who are proponents of regime change assume would be the case? Or are there other scenarios, post-Maduro that we should be looking at? Because, my sense is U.S. policymakers should not be planning strategy and policy on best case assumptions, right? I mean, it's sort of like it's sort of like an Iraq style situation where we just assume, well, we could push Saddam out of Baghdad. The Iraqis can replace, you can use their own oil wealth to reconstruct their own country, and eventually we'll establish elections, and magically a pro-Western democracy will be sitting in Baghdad one day. So, what's the risk of us sort of going down those lines in Venezuela, in your opinion?
I think they're pretty high. The striking thing about U.S. regime changes, say in Iraq and Libya, is that there was no plan for the aftermath, or rather, there were many plans held by different parts of the government, but there was no actual policy adopted about what to do. Different players had different ideas about what would done, whether it was putting Chalabi in charge, or the institutions will hold together and we can just substitute a new leader. And I have seen no plausible thinking done about how this would work in Venezuela. I think the arguments that people are making, the optimists, I would say the regime change optimists here, are two. One is the Panama analogy, which Chris mentioned, which is a bit laughable given the differences between the two places. It's a tiny geographic country with a very small population that already had a significant U.S. military presence in the country. So it's just it's like people making the Germany and Japan analogy for Iraq and Afghanistan. Advanced industrial countries that were economically well off and ethnically homogeneous, and had been crushed in a 4-year war, to places with no experience of democracy that are ethnically divided, that have been at war, that have had personalist dictators, destroying everything, and so forth. So the Panama analogy is pretty tenuous. The second argument that's being made is, well, there's this pro-democracy movement, right? And most Venezuelans want democracy. They want to get rid of Maduro, and the leader of the opposition will simply be coronated, or there'll be a coronation, and she'll just be able to take over with very little difficulty. Of course, we've heard that before, and it very rarely works like that. And of course, is anybody really shocked that the majority of Venezuelans would like to get rid of Maduro? I mean, if you asked Iraqis before 2003, what are they going to say, right? The same thing. Question is, can you do operations like this without things blowing up in your face? And the recent cases for the U.S. Are not optimistic on this score, and they're not really outliers. If one looks at the research that Lindsey has done, the research that I have done, it's not an aberration that things go sideways when this happens. In my research, in my book, there's a couple things that can happen. One is called, and the one I would highlight in the Venezuela case is called military disintegration, basically where the state and the army kind of fall apart. And in this case, I would add there are already many armed groups in the countryside that are beyond the control of the government, and some of which, like the ELN from Colombia, have said we'll fight to defend Maduro, but which, in any event, if the regime is overthrown, they're going to become more active, take over more territory, and so forth. So that sort of has the recipe for insurgency written all over it. And so it seems, you're just opening up Pandora's box when you do these kinds of operations. And you get civil war. It's very likely that leaders who come to power through foreign imposed regime change are then overthrown violently by some other, by either rebels or other parts of the government. Relations tend not to improve that much between the two countries involved, the target and the intervener. And so, it doesn't look really optimistic. These arguments from the optimist side are not well thought out and not thinking through what actually happens on the ground.
Lindsey, I want to get your take on this too, because I know your research areas are covert regime change and just what could happen in the event that an established government is either dissolved by force or in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Alex. I see the same thing with the covert regime changes as the overt one. In this particular case, I mean, you could look through the hypothetical things. If there's a coup, there might be a military coup. But there's little reason to believe that the person that would come to power after Maduro would somehow be pro-American or more favorable to American interest. I think the more likely situation is that, it would open up a power vacuum. The conditions are ripe for some sort of low intensity conflict. As Alex mentioned, even favorable public opinion data in Venezuela shows that the Maduro regime maintains some loyalty from about a third of the population. And of course, that's a third of the population that includes the security apparatus, the people with guns. And so the question is, are they just going to surrender power? What would happen? Not only would you have the people from Maduro's government wanting to get back in power, there's a whole range of pro-regime militias, other paramilitary groups, transnational actors. I mean, it just really, you can't say exactly who would come to power afterwards, but the idea that it would be this simple transition and that democracy would bloom, I think it's the lowest probability outcome. Not to say it's impossible, but there's just not much historical precedent to say that it's likely.
Could I just add one point to
Of course.
that, Dan? Sure. So in some regime change, in the majority of regime changes, at least for me, done in an overt way, they're accomplished by military invasion. There's a handful that are done by sort of covert, compellant threats, threats of force, basically nothing from economic sanctions to speak of. And air power alone has never worked to get rid of a leader. It has sometimes worked in combination with ground power, but never by itself. And so what's the plan? Is the United States going to send 50, 75, 100,000 troops in on the ground? I really don't think so. So the plan must be air power, right? We're sending the Gerald Ford carrier task group carrier task force to the region, which amps up the air power threat. So then we're thinking about a Libya option with no friendly ground force, right? There's no militant movement. There's no rebels. There's nobody to capitalize on the air power on the ground. And we all know what happened in the wake of that. We learned from Iraq, well, we don't want to go in heavy because we'll get bogged down in this insurgency. So we'll go in light. We'll just use air power and support these rebels on the ground and not put our boots on the ground. And then, you have no control over what happens afterwards and the place completely disintegrated. So what's the plan? We have not heard any articulation of said plan.
Chris, you want to add something?
Yeah, and I'm also worried about one scenario leading to another where we think that we can do this on the cheap. We think that we can do this with air power alone. We smash the government. It creates all kinds of chaos that begins spilling over, and then that becomes, and that then compels or impels people in the administration to start sending in troops, and we get mission creep, and it escalates, and we get increasingly bogged down there. Like, we're very used to having these kinds of interventions that rip apart other societies that are nonetheless on the other side of the world, and we can kind of go in and break everything, and then after a decade or so, we decide to cut our losses and we leave, and we leave those societies in a state of I don't know, disrepair, to put it politely. But this is a state that is much more proximate to us, and where the consequences felt by the U.S. public will likely be much higher, and that will create much, much more of a demand among Americans, probably, to resolve this situation somehow. We started it. We're now dealing with the consequences. They're not limited to the other side of the world, and that may create a lot of demand to send in lots of troops, tens of thousands, maybe more. And that is not really what any of us signed up for. It's not what the Trump administration ran on, right? Getting out of all these unnecessary wars was supposed to be the plan. And so it's just very hard to see what the possible you had brought up best case scenarios and not making foreign policy based on best case scenarios. I'm not even sure what the best case scenario here is really supposed to be, other than just that we kind of, we weaken Maduro and then it all resolves itself, right? As though the society itself is just kind of pregnant with an already available alternative that's just waiting to get a little push, right? And we've heard that kind of rationale before for these kinds of interventions, and it never happens.
Well, see, I mean, I take your point, Chris, and that's I agree 100% with it. I would add that there's a regional dimension here too. I mean, you have Colombia, Brazil, Chile, countries in the Caribbean, Argentina. I mean, would any of these countries, theoretically or even practically speaking, support something like this? I mean, nobody in the region particularly likes Maduro as a human being. I think we can all agree he's a horrible administrator. He's basically turned his country into a complete basket case. It's got some of the highest inflation rates in the world. It's lost about 80% of its GDP over the last 10 years. And, it imprisons political dissidents every week. I mean, there's no argument that he's a horrible person, a bad guy, and a terrible governor of a state. But with that being said, would any country in the region, in Latin America writ large, actually support ousting him either covertly or through more overt military force? I think maybe the Trump administration assumes that might be the case. They could pick off maybe some right-wing governments that might be interested in something like this. But how realistic, Alex, do you think that scenario would be? I mean, it doesn't seem like the region's all too interested in seeing, thousands of American troops doing a wider scale version of '89 Panama.
With the caveat that I'm not an expert in Latin American politics, I think Argentina has about 20 billion reasons to go along, given that the United States is going to bail out the regime down there, and it just won, which helped it win big in the election the other day. I think a country like El Salvador, with a sort of right-wing personalist style leader, would be supportive of this because why not? He's getting support from Trump, and so regimes like that, right, of this sort of ideological ilk, who are benefiting from relations with Trump and indeed sort of emulating him in terms of democratic backsliding, will go along. Essentially, we're paying for that. The leftist regimes in the region are obviously not going to be on board with this. So Colombia is already dissented and is paying the price for that. Brazil, right, led by Lula da Silva, is not going to be on board with something like this. And as Lindsey has said and can tell you at great length, the history of regime change in Latin America is long and abysmal. And I don't think really most countries want to turn back the clock and go back to an era where the United States military forces are landing on their shores to change their regimes. So the question is, does that have much influence with the Trump administration? No, of course not. But will it damage relations with these countries? Yes, it will. Will it, say, accelerate their movements away from the United States in various areas? China has become quite involved in Latin America, loaning money. Brazil's now selling all its soybeans to China because Trump put huge tariffs on China, and now they won't buy American soybeans. So it just, doesn't make a lot of sense from a regional standpoint.
Lindsey, I want to kind of shift to the covert stuff. I mean, as you know, New York Times reported, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, that Trump has authorized the CIA to do covert operations inside Venezuela. To what extent do you think those options, like what would those options be, hypothetically speaking? Is it just kind of disinformation? Would it be more kinetic stuff like blowing up oil pipelines to kind of further destabilize the economics of the country? I realize I'm sort of asking you to speculate here, but I'm interested in what those options could be, hypothetically.
Yeah, great. Well, I think the first point that we should make about covert action is that the entire rationale for covert action is to maintain plausible deniability about your state's role in the intervention. And you do that to, decrease the likelihood of military escalation, to keep U.S. boots off the ground, to lower the cost of the operation, to avoid all the normative backlash for doing, ugly, illegal things. And by effectively announcing to the world that you're trying to covertly overthrow a regime, you not only own the operation and all the consequences that come from it, it also sorts of invites you to do these, what I think would effectively be half measures. You could try to sabotage the regime by blowing up some things, assassinating some figures within it. But I just, I don't think it's likely to succeed. And if it could succeed in bringing about a change in government, to our earlier conversations, that doesn't mean that government that comes to power is going to be pro-American or democracy or act in American interest. And I think it's easy to destabilize a government, and there's a number of covert things that we could do to do that. But I don't think that necessarily translates into pro-American outcomes. In fact, there's very little reason to suggest that would do that. And if you just, you look at the statistics on covert regime change, I could go through them one by one, but, we had a number of different assassination operations during the Cold War. Not one of them ever actually killed the target, although a number of U.S.-backed leaders were inadvertently killed during U.S.-backed coups. Military coups were more effective. They succeeded roughly 2/3 of the time. But oftentimes they just brought somebody else to power who was equally brutal, not necessarily willing to act in the U.S. interest anymore. Supporting dissidents, was the least successful tactic. Fewer than 10% of those cases actually brought the group to power. And in the few cases that they did, like the Taliban in Afghanistan, it didn't work out for us either. And so there's really just not much to point to where you could say that this is going to have an effective result.
Is this more of like a political statement then? I mean, what's the purpose? Does the administration know that this is such a low likely success, is such a low likely outcome, or do they genuinely believe? Do you think they genuinely believe that they could kind of chip away at the regime and kind of, disassociate some of the high-level military leadership from Maduro? Because as Alex said, we've done this before, and during Trump's first term, the whole purpose of this quote-unquote maximum pressure campaign in Venezuela was to fracture the regime and kind of force Maduro to go into self-imposed exile. So it seems like the administration is sort of reverting back to its previous assumptions, but with more resources. Would that be a fair assessment, or is there something I'm missing here?
It's hard to say what they're thinking. I mean, when I tried to make sense of it, not only is the historical record very clear about these operations, there's been a number of internal studies within the U.S. government. The CIA has been asked to review their history, and they can also not point to these successes. And so I'm sure the Trump administration is aware of that. I think, neocon hardliners like Rubio are obviously very optimistic about regime change. I'm not exactly sure why they are so optimistic. You could argue that potentially they're doing this in order to increase coercive leverage over Maduro for the sake of negotiations. But the fact that they cut off negotiations when they were going so well and he was making such enormous concessions makes that seem less credible. So you kind of just have to scratch your head and wonder what's going on here.
Yeah, I do that every day, frankly, watching this administration, regardless of what policy we're talking about. Chris, you wanted to circle back on a question I asked Alex.
Yeah, you had asked about how much support the administration might get from other states in the region, and it is important to note, and this is partially a function of the fact that there's been a kind of pink tide 2.0 in the region, but the U.S. really can't depend on support from the rest of the OAS or other countries in the hemisphere at this point, and I think that problem is being exacerbated by the fact that we have, the Trump administration seems to have decided to be a particularly heavy-handed hegemon, regional hegemon. And this includes all kinds of other things that nobody would have ever anticipated, whether it's threatening Greenland or Canada or whatever. So I think that there's a whole other issue here, which is that what the U.S. should really want, in my view, in the hemisphere is to keep other great powers from the Eurasian landmass at an arm's length, right? And that's really what the whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine was about. We want to get, the other great powers out of our hemisphere. We want to maintain a nice big buffer of insulation against them, and that's one of the core. One of our core lines of defense, right? What I think this is more of a long-term risk, and one that isn't necessarily acute right now, and one that I don't want to inflate too much, right? But there is a problem here with acting as a particularly heavy-handed and hostile great power in the hemisphere and pushing other states in the hemisphere closer to China or whoever. Right, other states that we don't want to have more influence close to home. You've already seen a lot of this with Lula in Brazil, and we were acting covertly in some of the efforts a few years back to put him in jail and so forth. There's plenty of cases, right? I don't have to enumerate them all, of the ways in which we have been incentivizing states in the region to look for protection elsewhere, right? The same way that states in Eastern Europe look to us for protection from Russia, or states in East Asia look to us for protection from their big, scary neighbor, right? There's really no reason for us to be doing that, though, right? There's no security imperative that should make us want to do that. Quite the opposite. We should be looking to adopt some kind of a new good neighbor type policy, something like that, which would also afford us more cooperation and support from other states in the region on the issues that do matter to us, like drugs, like immigration, economic matters, whatever else. Right. So we're shooting ourselves in. The point I'm making is just that we're shooting ourselves in the foot by engaging in these kinds of heavy-handed, hostile, overbearing, hegemonic policies. And if the point of this whole situation in Venezuela is to make an example of the regime in order to scare other left-leaning states in the region, then I think that we're not actually furthering basic U.S. foreign policy goals.
Lindsey, you want to jump in and add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with Christopher on that. I think that, what we see is the Trump administration trying to reestablish the American sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. And there's been a number of things where they explicitly said this over Panama and Greenland and so forth. I happen to be writing a book on spheres of influence. And when I talk about how states create it, there's really, two things that they do simultaneously. One is coercion, having the threat of force, at least implicit in their actions. And the other is co-optation. And the problem with coercion is that it leads to a lot of nationalist backlash. You do these things, you overthrow governments, you act heavy-handedly, people don't like you violating their sovereignty, and they get resentful of you. And in the US case, I think acting in such a heavy-handed manner is not only in Venezuela, but for other states in the region, making them more wary of us. And if it's coming at this time where we're trying to compete for influence against the Chinese, I think a lot of people will say, well, maybe the Chinese are more reliable partners than the United States. So I actually think it's very counterproductive towards the goal of establishing a sphere of influence. Just a quick example to say this. I mean, you can look at the American and the Soviet sphere of influences in Europe during the Cold War. Soviets relied very heavily on coercion, and what happened? They lost the entire thing. The Soviet Union crumbled, and the Warsaw Bloc collapsed. The United States, our creation of the sphere of influence was much more built on co-optation. It's been called an empire by design or by invitation because they welcomed. Not to say we didn't do coercive things, but we relied more heavily on cooperation, co-optation, and it's persevered. And so I think if we do want to do that, we need to make positive arguments for why they want to have a closer relationship with the United States over our great power competitors.
Yeah, that's great. Alex, please.
Yeah, just make a couple of points in this regard. One, to get to the grand strategy piece, which I think Chris was hinting at. What are the big threats out there to U.S. interests and not survival necessarily, but what are the big problems facing the United States? It's not Nicolas Maduro. It's China. Not necessarily that I believe these things, but China, Russia to a certain extent. So, keep your eye on the ball, right? Where are the big foreign policy challenges for the United States right now? They're just in different places, and they're far more important. The second point is, well, how do you want to enlist allies in a conflict like that, in a sort of global competition with another great power? Is it by going after countries in your hemisphere and alienating friendly regimes where there's really no problem in the hemisphere that would warrant stepping on toes and alienating countries that are inherently friendly? And the third thing I would just mention is there's no question, nobody's arguing there's not a problem with drugs and drugs coming into the United States. And we know where they're coming from, and it's not Venezuela, I would just add. And yes, interdiction has a role to play there, not by bombing random boats in the Caribbean or the Pacific. That's not going to accomplish much of anything. The traffickers are already adapting their methods, and the vast majority comes by land anyway. But the part that goes unnoticed, unmentioned here is where's the demand for drugs coming from? It's coming from the United States. And as long as there's that market there, people are going to spend money on drugs like this. It's going to keep coming. And so what does the Trump administration want to do about that? Well, they want to slash those programs that might help people kick addiction and to reduce the demand. Right? There's a supply issue and a demand issue. They want to deal and most administrations only want to deal with the supply issue and not very effectively at that. But the demand issue, right, is where the key or a key, at least, half of the equation lies. And so one would think that if one was serious about dealing with America's drug addiction, one would want to take those kinds of domestic programs seriously.
We're coming up a little bit past 11 o'clock. It's 11:01. So I think I'm going to close by asking all three of you what an alternative policy should be. And we sort of harped on diplomacy being probably the more pragmatic, less costly way to kind of extract concessions from Maduro. The problem, of course, is Trump seems to have told Rick Grenell, who was his primary contact in Caracas, to cease all discussions with the regime there. But Trump is also somebody who changes his mind a lot. right? So what he says and does one week could be completely nullified the next week. So I was just maybe wondering, well, for all three of you, do you think discussions are completely off the table? Do you envision maybe diplomacy, some sort of diplomatic interaction with Maduro or his subordinates? Could it be reinstituted in the future, or are we sort of looking at scenarios between bad and bad, even bad, and worst case? So maybe Chris, you can go first, and then we'll do Alex, and then Lindsey, you can close out for us.
Well, it's always hard to know what the Trump administration is actually prepared to do. I mean, they've engaged in so many reversals with different countries. There was fire and fury with North Korea, and then they become best friends. But that being said, they're obviously moving a lot of combat power into the region, and that may all just be for show. But it's there's a point that's been made a few times. It's hard to see how this can be gunboat diplomacy when Maduro's already made so many concessions and put so many things on the table. Like peaceful, voluntary regime change, more or less, is on the table. So you asked about alternatives. I mean, in some ways, I guess the coy answer would be like the alternative is nothing, right? But really, what we should be doing is cutting deals, right? We can cooperate with Venezuela on, to an extremely limited extent, because they just, there aren't that many drugs that traverse Venezuela. We can cooperate on that, but we can certainly cooperate on immigration. We can cooperate, they have large oil reserves. The U.S. has no problem dealing with unsavory regimes in order to advance its own interests. And the fact that that regime could be swapped out for maybe a better one, that's already been offered, right? So we're not advancing anything by pursuing this course. Whether or not we can pull back and come to our senses and maybe make some kind of deal down the line, it's always possible. But I think the whole reason why we're doing this event is that it looks increasingly unlikely or hard to imagine.
Alex, please go ahead.
Sure. I can only speculate as to what the possibility of returning to diplomacy is within the Trump administration. It's so hard to figure out what's going on there. That seemed to be gaining concessions. And then we decided not to take yes for an answer, and seemingly turn to force or threats of force, airstrikes, whatever is coming down the pike. There's no real drug problem here. There's no terrorism problem, right? If to the extent there's an issue for U.S. homeland well-being with Venezuela, it's refugees and people. So why aren't we pursuing some sort of negotiations to help deal with that? That seems to me to be the real issue here. But what we're seeing now is the demonization of another leader, and he's not a good guy. Let's not kid ourselves. But this is what happened before Iraq. It's what happened before Libya. Right? You just turn these people into people you can't deal with, and narrow down your options to having to get rid of them. So, I mean, I would say go back to diplomacy or just containment, right? There's no military threat here. There's no real problem.
I agree with what Chris and Alex have just said. I think, we should return to diplomacy. The fact that Maduro's government was willing to make such extensive concessions, I think, is a good sign that they would be open potentially to going back to them. I think the odds that we'll get a better deal through regime change is just highly unlikely.
All right, there you have it. Chris McCallion, Alexander Downs, Lindsey O'Rourke, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for listening and watching, and hopefully, we can find a way out of this morass. I mean, speaking on a personal level, it reminds me of Iraq, but in 2025. And I realize Iraq is a kind of an overworn analogy that we use quite frequently. But in this case, you have dodgy intelligence, you have an administration who's sort of unwilling to give us basic information about, some of the claims that they're making about drugs being boarded onto these vessels that they're destroying. And you have what we didn't discuss, which we could probably discuss in another panel, is the legality of it all. Is everything that we're doing indeed legal and constitutional, or is the United States making unilateral, war powers through unilateral decision making in the executive and sort of sidelining the United States Congress? But that's another subject. But anyway, thank you for joining us, listening, and we'll be back with you shortly with other events and policy papers. Thank you.
Thank you.